Okay, welcome everyone. We'll get started with our session now. This is the second version of our partner training webcast series for Notes Migrator for SharePoint, and I'm the product manager for that product, Steve Walsh. So here's the outline for the general series. So session 1 today is going to be migration basics with the Notes Migrator for SharePoint Designer client. And then next week we're going to continue on with talking about using the migration console and taking a bigger picture of doing analysis of all your notes databases and automating some of the things. So the connector between these two things is the migration jobs. So the migration jobs you design in the designer client you can also run and automate across many databases with the migration console. In the third session we'll look more deeply at some of the advanced things you can do when you're designing your migration jobs. And with the fourth session we're going to take a break and look more at tool deployment, how you would install, for example, the Quest import service, which I'll mention in a minute, as well as some of the other notes targets like migrating from domino.doc or from QuickPlace and Quicker. So in session 5 we're going to start to look beyond migrating the content, and we're going to look at migrating application designs. And so these will be things like migrating views and forms and generating content types and all sorts of cool stuff. The last session we're going to talk more about how to manage large migration projects, because we always get tons of questions about how can I cost out these projects, how can I estimate, how can I find out what notes databases are out there and which ones are being used, and how do I think about explaining this to my customers, and so on. So we'll also, any remaining items or questions that come in, we'll try to capture in that last session. So the other thing I want to mention is that we are using some beta code for these demos. We're using the Notes Migrator for SharePoint 6.1 beta, and that beta just went live last week. And so at the end of this session we'll show you how you can sign up for the beta, and we expect these recorded versions of this partner training to last well beyond the 6.1 ship date. So it's good to be covering those features. And that ship date, by the way, is scheduled for January, so it's about 2.5–3 months away from the recording date. So surely the product will change a little bit between now and then, but I'll try to do a good job of pointing out what's new in 6.1. So almost everything I'm going to be talking about today is stuff you can do with the current shipping product 6.0. But just in case I stumble on something new, I'll be sure to highlight that. Okay, so for today, here's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be digging into the Notes Migrator for SharePoint Designer client. We'll start with just an overview of the full product, Notes Migrator for SharePoint, and then we're going to look at migrating databases, migrating standard template-based databases like your document library, discussion lists, and calendars, and then digging into the more custom databases, which could be anything. Of course, Notes is used to build mostly custom applications, and those are the ones that are really hard to migrate. So we'll be spending a lot of time talking about how you would go up to a custom database, figure out what's in there, and what you want to migrate out of there. Along the way, we'll be talking about some of the more complex aspects of migration, including document links and mapping usernames and all the permissions, who's allowed to read the list, who's allowed to read the document, and so on. We'll be looking at doing some transforming of data using formulas. You can actually use formulas to convert data between reading it from Notes and writing it to SharePoint. So you can merge fields and so on. So that's an important feature of our product for custom applications especially. We'll be talking a lot more about migrating to pages in session 3, but I'll show you a couple quick examples of doing Wiki page migration, and then one of my favorite topics is the rendering and archiving documents in SharePoint, because that's a great solution for some of those applications where they may have been complex in Notes, but you really no longer need all that functionality. You just want to archive that content in a good way in SharePoint that's searchable and looks nice, and so on. So let's start with our product overview. This is our concept diagram that's been growing now for many years as we keep adding features. And it's still, the bulk of this real estate is dedicated to the content migration story. So we migrate content from, of course, Notes applications, Quicker, QuickPlace, Domino.doc, and then we put it over into SharePoint. And we support SharePoint as well as SharePoint Online, Office 365, and so on. And then in SharePoint, you have a lot of choices as to how you're going to write this content out. A lot of Notes applications will get migrated over to lists, in particular custom lists, where you've added your custom fields and so on to kind of mimic what you had in Notes. But you also might be migrating straight to document libraries in some cases. If you have a lot of attachments that you don't want to really build list items, you just want to put the attachments in a document library, you can do that. For Domino.doc would be a good example of that. And you can also create pages in SharePoint. So it's for certain Notes applications, it's going to be really nice to be able to just create a web page for every Notes document. This is particularly good if you have a publishing type of solution. You might want to take all your Notes documents and convert them to Wiki pages or web part pages or publishing pages and so on. For the more complex applications, you could always use InfoPath. So you could take the every Notes document and generate an InfoPath XML document, and we'll put it in the form library. So this is a good high-end solution, and we'll be talking more about using InfoPath in session 3. You can also generate other types of documents as you migrate. So we can generate Word documents or PDF documents, and these are great solutions for those really rich text type of documents where the most interesting part is just a bunch of rich text, and you want to just put that in a nice way so that it will stick around for a long time. You're going to generate Word documents from your Notes rich text documents or PDF documents, and then we just stick them in a SharePoint library for you where you can search them and so on. In the case of Word, we actually support custom Word templates. We support content controls. So if you've designed a Word template that's kind of laid out with a bunch of content controls, you can put the Notes data in the various content controls. So a very powerful feature there. And then finally, we can migrate to SQL Server. So sometimes you decide that a Notes application, you don't really want to be putting it in SharePoint lists and libraries for whatever reason. We had a customer just last week who found that they had a Notes form that had something like 2,000 fields in it, and multiple levels of nested tabs within tabs with 2,000 controls on their form. So that's beyond the SharePoint limits for a list, and so they decided in that case they're probably going to be migrating that whole thing to SQL Server. And then they're still going to build a UI so it looks good in SharePoint, but the raw data is going to be going straight to a SQL Server table. So important part of our SharePoint story, that in those rare cases that you need to, you can migrate to SQL Server. So along the way is kind of our capabilities for the content migration. Rich text is the really hard one, and that's where we tend to differentiate a lot from other tools. So Notes documents are been authored using this custom proprietary Notes rich text editor that had all sorts of bells and whistles in it, like nested tables and fonts and embedded images and objects and so on. So if your users are creating really complex rich text documents like that, you're going to want a tool that will get that over looking really good in SharePoint, otherwise your users are not going to be very happy. So as part of that rich text, we have embedded images, attachments, objects. Document links is a big part of this. So a link between two Notes documents should keep working as you slowly migrate all your pieces over to SharePoint. And the security part, access control lists, all the way down to the document level security on certain Notes documents. We make sure we preserve that. And all the complex custom data. So this would be all the custom fields, your category fields, your subject fields, your customer number fields, all the fields you've added into your Notes forms and views. Our tool is really good at digging through every nook and cranny of your Notes application and getting all that data, because the last thing you want is data loss. And you want a tool that can get all that. And that includes multi-valued items and all these strange Notes things. Notes is not a relational database. It's quite a sophisticated, loose object store where every document might have different schema. So the tool's got to help you kind of get all that over into the way SharePoint wants to manage data, and so we kind of excel at that function. And then there's the metadata. So if a document says it was created by John in 2006, it should still say that over in SharePoint. The last created by, last modified by, times and dates and things like that. So that kind of metadata we just preserve automatically for you. So that's all about the content migration, and that's where we're going to be talking about this in today's session, and then deeper into this in session 3. We'll also be talking about the analysis environment. So our tool is a complete analysis tool, which we'll be talking about next week, and that helps you figure out which applications haven't been used recently, which ones are complex, which ones have attachments that are going to be blocked by your SharePoint limits, and many other things that you want to know before you migrate. We do the design migration. So design migration is not pressing a button and getting the whole design copied over to SharePoint. The tools can help you do bits and pieces of design migration. So for example, migrating forms, take a notes form and migrate it over to an info path form, or migrating views is a new feature we'll be showing you, and migrating content types. And some people even consider migrating the schema to be part of design migration. The part of the tool that just looks at your notes schema and tries to quickly reproduce a similar schema in SharePoint. That's really sort of design migration in many people's eyes. We have a lot of features for kind of automating the project. So you can put in rules into our tool to say, for example, for every team room, I want to automatically provision a site over here where the new team site template will be used, and the new team site name will be equal to the old team site name, and then we're going to automatically run some content migration jobs. We're going to automatically run one migration job to migrate all the discussion data over to a discussion list in that team site, another one for calendars, and so on. And so you can see that for complex applications you might be running mini jobs, have rules about provisioning things and security mapping and so on. And so we try to make it easy to automate that and do things in large batches, so you don't have to do things one at a time. So that's the overview of the tool. Now, before we get into actual migration demos and walkthroughs, I want to just give you an overview of the clients that we have available and the server connections that we have available. So for the clients, we give you a choice of 3 different clients you can use. And so when you install our tool, we have a clients installer and a server installer. And the clients installer will just automatically put these 3 clients on your desktop. And today we're going to be spending most of our time with this one. This is what we call our designer client. Notes Migrator for SharePoint Designer. And this is good for running one migration job, and it's good for just going up to a new database, inspecting it, and starting to migrate something. So it's the simplest client in many ways in terms of just focusing on one migration job. Contrast that with this client here, which is our migration console. And the migration console is the piece that can look across your entire notes environment. And so if you look at this tiny screenshot, every line here is really a notes database. And so you can select one, look at the properties, do some analysis, and then you can select 20 of them and migrate them all in one big batch according to the rules that you predefined or the work that you've queued up for those databases. So it's a good tool for looking at the larger migration project and doing bigger things. And then finally we have our command line tool, which allows you to run these same migration jobs, the one you might have designed with the designer. You can run them from your own scripts. So here's an example where we're running our NMSP command script. We're specifying the job that we want to migrate, and only we're specifying a different target list. So you can imagine a script kind of looping through the same migration job 50 times. Each time it's picking a different notes database and putting the data in a different list or on a different site. So you can see some possibilities for overriding things every time and doing some interesting automation using your tool. So for bulk migration, you can either use our migration console or you can write your own scripts and do it this way. Now, to dig a little deeper into the differences between these 3 clients, the designer client, again, is one migration job, and the scope of a migration job is reading notes documents out of one Notes database and putting them into one list with one particular schema. And we can do provisioning at this level of lists and libraries, and so we can provision a list using your custom list template that you designed or any other template. The migration jobs themselves are actually XML files, and they live in the file system. So when you run a migration job, you're reading the job description out of the file system, and then you're logging the results, and we have these big log files, and they live in the file system as well. So in the migration console, on the other hand, everything lives in a repository. It's a big database that we keep, where we found all the databases, and we've associated the jobs with the various databases, and we associate the resulting log files with the jobs all in this big repository database. And so, like I said, you can do many databases, many jobs per database, and that gives you your bulk migration capabilities and your automation capabilities. You can also do your provisioning here. You can provision at the site level now, and not just at the list and library level, like the designer client does. And of course, this is where you would do the discovery and analysis and the classification of your applications ahead of time. Okay, on the server side, we give you two main options for how you're going to connect all these clients to SharePoint. And so most of us are using SharePoint 2010 now, so we kind of have it easy. We don't have to install anything on the SharePoint server itself. We can do all the migration we need to do through the SharePoint web services that are now part of SharePoint 2010. So no server installation is required, and we can connect to your environment in different ways. Of course, all of our clients can connect using Windows authentication or name and password authentication. If your environment uses claims-based authentication, this is really your only choice, is to use the web services. That's the only way we can connect to a SharePoint environment that's using claims-based authentication. And that includes Office 365, which uses claims-based authentication. So we can migrate straight to Office 365 with full functionality using the native Microsoft web services. And also we can migrate to the Office 365 dedicated. This also used to be known as BPOS dedicated. And with dedicated, you really have two choices. Microsoft has a recommended guidance for migrating content through a staging environment, so you migrate to a staging and then you just ship up the whole content database up to your hosting center. We support that certainly, but we also support doing direct migrations to Office 365, and we're the only one who does that. And the large customers find it's important to be able to do both. Maybe you're going to do 80–90% of your migration through the staging approach, but then you're always going to have some bits and pieces that you want to do real-time migration, to incrementally catch up or to do that one list you forgot in the big batch. So it's important to have a tool that does both direct migration as well as the staging migration for Office 365. Yes? That's a great question. It's really the question, if that wasn't captured on the recording, is what level of access do you need to be able to do SharePoint migrations? And the answer is it depends on what you're trying to do. So it's really the equivalent of if you were logging in with a browser. So if you tell the tool to provision a new subsite, you've got to have site administrator access on that site collection. If you're telling the tool to provision a list, you need to have the access to do that. If you're just writing records, you only need author access on that list that you're writing to. So the tool, gracefully does whatever it can do and then gives you an error message if you try to do something that you personally don't have access to. So you're logging in with your normal accounts, and it just depends on what your account has access to do. So the other choice is the high-end choice is to use the Quest import service. And here you actually do have to install our code on your SharePoint front-end servers. And our import service is basically its own web service. It implements a web service that's an alternative to using the SharePoint web services. And this is your only choice, by the way, if you're still on SharePoint 2007, because the 2007 web services from Microsoft were very limited and didn't do what it needed to do for migration. Even if you're on 2010, the big advantage of using the import service is the performance. Especially if you have large attachments, then you will find that the performance of using the import service could be a lot faster. Sometimes we've seen even 5 times faster. So if you have hundreds of gigabytes or terabytes of large attachment data that you need to migrate, you're probably going to want to look at the import service. And we'll talk later about our link tracking system, but one of the advantages of using the import service is you get better real-time link tracking experience for the end users. They click on a link, they immediately get redirected to the right place. We can still make that work with this mode of migration, with the web services migration. It's just not quite as immediate. So we'll cover that more shortly. So here's kind of a recap in a diagram here. This is using our tool to do the web services migration. And so you're going to be doing something on some workstation, pretty much any Windows workstation that's got enough headroom. And this workstation needs to have a Notes client installed. So people typically, we're up to Notes 8.5 now. So people are typically installing, a Notes 6, 7, or 8 client on their workstation, and this client is configured to access the dominant environment. So this is just a normal Notes client install. When you go through the Notes install, you establish which Notes ID file you're going to use, and the install does some handshaking with the Domino service to exchange certificates and so on. And so once this Notes client can connect to whatever Domino service you need to connect to, then you go ahead and install our client. So like I said, we have one client installer that installs all 3 clients, and all 3 of these clients basically function as Notes C API programs, which means that we're calling into the Notes DLLs to do all of our Notes work. And so those Notes DLLs are the ones that are talking to the Domino server. So the good part is it's very low impact in your Domino environment. You don't have to do anything special there. As far as the Domino servers are concerned, this is just normal Notes traffic coming over the wire. So you're just looking like a really busy Notes user here as you're reading all this data. And then for the client side, we write to the SharePoint web services. And we also have this other component called our link tracking redirector, and we actually have 2 of these. And this is an optional piece, but if you want your doc links to have a nice user interface to them, so when someone clicks on a doc link, they'll get redirected to the right place. You can install, we have a sandbox version for production environments where you don't want to install any untrusted code. And so because this solution is a sandbox safe solution, any site administrator can install it on any site collection easily. So for the Quest import service, it's a little more complicated. Here on the server, we have the Quest import service, and that's our Windows Communication Foundation web service that we talk to. And then we also have some additional components. There's I think it's a site level, might be a farm level solution, I can't remember now. I think it's a farm level solution that you install on your SharePoint farm, and then this includes some configuration pages, so you can go configure this import service. It also includes, again, that same Quest link tracking redirector page, which I'll describe shortly. Only this is a more powerful one because it doesn't have to run in the sandbox. It can connect to the database and work quickly, redirect users to the right page and so on. And optionally, you can also install that same configuration interface in central administration. So if you prefer to administer the import service using central administration, you can install this solution here. But this is optional, and frankly, most people don't even bother with this anymore because this requires central admin access and all that. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about migrating standard applications. And This will show just doing a standard application. I'm gonna show you migrating a document library. We'll get to see a lot of the core functionality of the tool. Um, the ability to map all the data items, including really high fidelity rich text migration, and all the other things I mentioned about images, attachments, the document metadata, permissions, document links, and so on. And so when you're migrating to standard notes databases, we basically have predefined data definitions that you can use. So you don't have to do any work to define how you want to read the data out of Notes or how you want to write it to SharePoint. For all the standard templates, we give you data definitions that handle that for document libraries, discussions, calendars, tasks, team rooms, and contacts templates. There's probably others that I'm forgetting. But all the standard templates and Notes kind of map over to a similar standard template in SharePoint. And so those are pretty much just point, click, and migrate there. So here's a quick screenshot. Here's a Notes document we're going to migrate. And you can see it has all the components we're talking about, doc links. Here's an embedded OLE object here. The standard data items as well as the metadata. And then on the SharePoint side, here's a screenshot of a SharePoint 2007 example where we've migrated these fields, the nice rich text, all the doc links, and the attachments, and then we preserve the metadata here. So let's now go into our demos, and we can see that in real time. So let's first start the Notes client. I'll show you the before version. Here's that document library. And if I open one of these Notes documents, you can see if I go into edit mode here, this section right here is the big rich text field, and a good percentage of your Notes applications will have at least one big rich text field. It's typically called the body field internally, but it could have any name. And in that rich text, we could have all sorts of things, nested tables and so on, and doc links. We have all these fields, category field, subject field, and then the metadata, like I said here. So if I were to click on this doc link here, it'll redirect me to another Notes document. And this one has an embedded attachment. And here's another doc link. This is the old style doc link, which is these little yellow icons. Clicks over another Notes document. So let's go ahead and migrate this. So this is the Notes Migrator for SharePoint Designer client, and it's pretty simple to use. You can choose whether you want to migrate from Notes or one of the other sources, and then, oops, I see I have something grayed out here. Let me restart the tool. There we go. So I'm going to select the Notes database, and I'm going to select that same document library. So I could be looking at my various Domino servers. In this case, I'm just going to look at a local Notes database that I have on my laptop. And let's pick that same document library. And now when I select that database, it prompts me for it asks me, do I want to load a default data definition, because it recognized that database was based on a template that we know about. It's based in this case on the standard R7 web document library, which is one of the standard Notes templates. And so our tool says, hey, we already have a data definition for that. Do you want to pick that? And I'll say yes. And so I've loaded that data definition in here. I could specify if I wanted to a maximum number of records and so on. So with this data definition that I loaded, it's basically the query for all the data that I'm going to be extracting out of Notes. And if I wanted to, I could preview that, and I could see here's all the columns we're going to be pulling out of Notes. It includes a lot of metadata columns, specific things like the status field, the subject, the category, and so on. So later I'm going to come back and show you how we might have, if this was a custom application, how we would have designed one of these data definitions from scratch. So in the SharePoint tab, very similar thing, I'm going to select where I want it to go. and I'm going to select my main site. Oh, looks like I got to wait for SharePoint to wake up here. Okay. Drill down into the content on my site, and let's pick this list right here. It's called Notes Migration Custom List. That's my kind of standard demo. And again, do you want to load the default data definition for custom list? Because we have a predefined list for that as well. I'm going to say yes. And because this is a demo I've done before, I'm going to delete the prior contents. And then later we'll come back and we can talk about, if we didn't want to delete the prior contents, some of our choices for kind of merging the old with the new. You know, we can detect whether documents have been modified, and for example, we could say we want to create a new version. If the notes version modified since last time, let's create a new version of that document using the SharePoint versioning. We'll come back to that later. So now that I've kind of loaded in the data definition for the notes side and the SharePoint side, it's a simple matter of mapping one to the other. And so we have here a lot of predefined mappings. All these data definitions come with kind of automatic mappings. So for this first pass, I'm just going to take the defaults. I'm going to, note subject is going to map to title, category is going to map to category, and so on. We're going to extract the HTML version of the body field. Remember that body field is that rich text field in the Notes application, and map it to the body field in SharePoint. And we're going to take all the attachments, images, and embedded objects, and we're going to make them attachments in the custom list items we're going to be generating. But these are just the default choices. You can change a lot of things here. You could, for example, put all the attachments in a separate document library. You could decide to map other fields. You could transform data, and so on. So we'll come back to that soon. I also want to check that we want to preserve the created modified identities and the created modified dates. So this is the metadata that I've talked about. And then finally, let's do some security mapping. Let's map the notes users and groups that we find in the access control list. So if you're not a notes person, the access control list is where you define who's allowed to read and write that particular notes database. We're going to be converting that over to access control permissions for the list that we're migrating to. Also, if that notes database was using roles, we're going, roles in a notes database map over to SharePoint groups, and we can also take the notes groups and generate SharePoint groups from that. So I'm just going to check all these boxes, even the document level security, and in a later slide I'm going to talk more about how all this security mapping works. And then finally I want to use the link tracking service for all my doc links, and that's our default here. So let's go ahead and just run this migration job. I'll run this, and by the way, I'll mention that this run button is changed with version 6.1. So if you press this run button in the shipping version, you're going to get a dialog that asks you if you want to save intermediate files and things like that. We now kind of bury that in this run button where you get a drop-down list of choices such as writing out to an intermediate file or loading from an intermediate file. So we'll come back to that in more detail. Because I've selected all these security options, the first thing we're doing is we're going through our user mapping process, and we're trying to map all the usernames. And so that happens before, all the usernames in the access control list get resolved before I read my first document. So because I don't have a very fast connection to my AD environment, that's taking a little longer than I'd like. Okay. Now we got through that part, the rest should be pretty fast. So now we're writing documents to SharePoint. Now while this is going on, notice we got some warnings here. So let's talk about how we're handling warnings. First thing is you can just hover over this and get the last warning. Or you can go to the Log Summary tab, and you can see there were 8 warnings here. And all these warnings are about user names. These are old notes names that we couldn't map over to SharePoint names. And we'll talk later about how we set up mappings of notes names over to Active Directory names. There's also some warnings here about blocked files. So, by default, SharePoint doesn't allow .exe files or files over a certain size, and so we're getting some warnings that we couldn't migrate certain attachments. Okay, well, our job is finished now, so we can go to that list. And so here we have our list with a lot of migrated documents. So let's open one of these. Here's a migrated document, and if I kind of expand this, you can see we did a nice job preserving that notes rich text, and we migrated it to a rich text body field in SharePoint list. Title field, category field, here's that attachment. And if I were to click on one of these doc links, like this one, it should migrate over to, and link me over to another document. So, also want to point out that the original metadata is preserved. This wasn't created by me today. It looks like it's created by Peter back in 2007. So that's kind of the simplest migration job for a custom list. And there's a lot of cool things about that. If I were to pull up some really complex rich text documents, we could see some interesting stuff in here. So here's one of our customer documents. That's got a table in it. This one has nested tables with spanned rows and so on. So we really encourage people to test this out with their own rich text documents, especially if you're looking at multiple tools. This is where you're going to see the tools differ from each other greatly. Take your most complex notes document and migrate it side by side with multiple tools, and I'm pretty sure we'll come out looking pretty good there. Okay, so let's now, I want to customize this job a little bit to show you a few extra things. So let's say I want to change things a little bit. Let's say I wanted to add another mapping. If I want to add a mapping, say from the category field into a folder field, folder is a special type of field where whatever data we map to the folder, we're going to assign folders to it. We're going to generate folders in this list. So I just want to make that one change. Maybe I'll turn the security mapping off this time, since that slowed the job down in my test environment. And let's also just show off that we can create a new list. So let's call this test list 1. And I'm going to say, yes, I want to give the tool permission to create a new list and add it to the quick launch area. So we can provision this list with our custom templates and so on. And let's just, without any further ado, run this job one more time. So now we're provisioning the new list, and then we're quickly writing out the documents. So I don't have to wait for this job to be done. I can just press the Go to List button now. And so this time, notice we have a new list called Test List 1. We have folders and subfolders. So the category was trees/oak, so I was able to navigate through the folder hierarchy, trees, and then oak, and then the documents that fell into that category. Okay, so let's pop back to our slides now and continue on with our content. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to drill down deeper into is the security mapping portion. So here's a screenshot of a Notes access control list, and like I said, this is where Notes databases define the security of the database, who's allowed to read it and what level of access they have. So the first thing in here is this list of users and groups, and so this administrators is a group, and that's referring to a group that's in the Domino directory, And then this is a user, Joe Cole / Proposition is a user in the Domino directory. And so we need to map those over to the equivalent domain users, which SharePoint's almost always running on top of Active Directory, but it's not always true. So whatever directory system you're using in SharePoint, you need to map the notes names over to those kind of names. And so we have a user mapping process where you can do user mapping based on a number of different lookups. You can do lookups in Domino directory, in Active Directory, or we can just create a big XML file that allows you to map all the notes names over to SharePoint names. So I'll show you more of how to configure that user mapping in just a couple minutes. So once we map the users to domain users, and then we add them to the site collection. So in order to access this new list, they have to be members of the site collection. If they're not already there, we'll add them as members. And then we'll give them the right permissions on the list or the library that we're migrating to. And we can also do permissions at the site level, if you prefer to do it that way. So based on the level of access they have, you can see that Joe is a designer in this database. He didn't have delete documents privileges. Based on the level of access they have, we'll set a specific set of permission levels for that person in that list. And that's really the most precise way you could think of migrating security from Notes over to SharePoint, is to set permission levels. Now, a slightly less precise option, but very nice alternative in some cases, is to set site security groups instead. So if you are using a SharePoint site template, it probably already has some predefined groups for you. So every template, for example, has a visitors group and an owners group and a members group. And then some custom site templates might have other groups, like an approvers group or whatever. And so the person who designed that site template intended that was how you should control security. So we kind of give you a choice. We can either just put people in the right group based on whatever level of access they have, or we can set them with explicit permission levels. And like I said, permission levels is kind of more high fidelity, that capture the nuances of note security, but putting them just in the right security group is going to be a lot more maintainable going forward. And it's kind of the SharePoint way of doing most security. So your choice. You can tell our tool to do either one. You can also map over to SharePoint groups. From your roles. So if you are using roles, a role is like a little miniature group that's scoped just to this one database. So you can see that Joe here is a member of these 4 groups that are checked. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take all these roles and we're going to generate groups in SharePoint, and we'll add Joe as a member of those groups. So we'll basically be provisioning these roles as groups in SharePoint. And then sometimes you want to kind of cross this line here. If administrators was a big group that was an Active Directory, you just want to translate them to the equivalent Active Directory group and add them as a member. But if it's not an Active Directory, you might want to generate a new SharePoint group that had all the same members that administrators had in Domino. And so you can kind of control that certain groups get mapped over to equivalent domain groups, other groups get mapped over to SharePoint groups. And then the final piece of this is the document level security. So you can see that we've looked at the metadata, who's the author of this document, and who's allowed to read the document. Notes has a concept of readers fields, which controls who can read documents, and writers field that controls who can write documents. And these writers fields may refer to users and groups explicitly, or it can refer to roles. So you might have a readers field with a role that points to one of these things, so then all the members of that group can read the document. And so we'll do the same thing with that. We'll migrate the metadata, the author, the created modified metadata, and the permission levels on the individual documents we're writing in SharePoint. Okay, the other piece that I want to talk about was how our link tracking service worked. So imagine that you had, 3 different databases, and in database A there's a document, and that document has 2 doc links, one that points to a record in database B and another one that points to a record in database C. So you come along and you run our tool and you migrate database A up to SharePoint and database B up to SharePoint. When we do that migration, we will write the new locations of these 2 documents in our own little databases. We call it our link tracking database. And that's just a SQL Server database that we maintain, and all your Notes clients can connect to this database. And so the idea is, for your whole migration project, every record that you migrate, you should be adding a record into this link tracking database. And then we also have our link redirector page. And so when we migrated document A, we converted those doc links into URLs that point to our redirector page, and we passed the redirector page the ID of the document. And so what happens is the redirector page will do a lookup in the database and figure out where's that document today. So for the link to document B, these red arrows, we do the lookup in the database, the link tracker page says, oh, okay, we know where that one is now, and we redirect the user automatically to B. And that's what you saw when I clicked on that link. All this was hidden, and we just immediately looked like we just navigated straight to B. Now if I had clicked on a link for something that we hadn't migrated yet, then we would do the lookup in the database, we would not find that document, and so we'd say, okay, well, I better redirect this user back to the Notes client. So the Notes client would pop up, and the user would get redirected to document C. So as you can see, all the documents these links will just redirect people to wherever the most recent location of that document is. And then remember I mentioned that we have migration to different targets like InfoPath or Pages or Word documents. This all uses the same link tracking service. So one day one link might migrate me to Word, another one might migrate me to a list item. And so that all works pretty seamlessly. Now at the end of your migration project, let's say you've migrated everything, we have a finalization process, and with the finalization process we will actually go back and edit this document one more time, and we'll replace that dynamic link with a permanent link from A to B and from A to C. And so now you can pull out that whole redirector page. So that's only something you need during that migration process. And so we call this process finalization, where we go edit this document and then make these links permanent links instead of dynamic links. And then the last piece I want to point out is that we can do this whole thing with URLs. So sometimes your Notes document doesn't have a true Notes doc link in it. Instead it has an HTTP link that happens to point to a Notes document that's sitting on a Domino web server. So we do the same thing. You configure our tool to recognize these particular URLs that are pointing to other Notes documents, and then we'll convert them to the URL now on SharePoint. So it's the exact same thing, only it's for URLs, not just doc links. Okay. So I want to quickly show you a little bit more in the code just to look at how that's working, just so that becomes a little bit more clear. Let's go back to the desktop, and I'm going to go back to that custom list that I migrated, and if I open this document, and remember we had these doc links in here, let me just copy that link up to our browser here. And so as you can see, we're actually not linking to the document, we're linking to the Quest link tracking, our redirector page, and we're passing it the Notes ID. And so the redirector page is going to redirect me to the right place. If I want to kind of debug what's going on a little bit, I can add an ampersand mode equals info here, and that's a parameter for our redirector page to display a little information instead of just redirecting you. So we get a little debugging information. We did the lookup in the database, and we see that this has been migrated. You can go to it in Notes, or you can look at it in SharePoint. So just a little debugging information as to where this document came from and where it's now pointing to in our redirector system. Okay, and I also promised you I'd follow up on the user mapping process, so I wanted to show you some of our options here. And this is the first time I've gone into the options section, so I'll spend a couple minutes here. First I'll go to our user mapping tab, and you can see that we've configured, in this case, that we want to map the notes names to site collection users using a text file lookup. And so in this case we're using this XML file here. And if I open that XML file in the browser, you can see it's a pretty simple file format. We have this notes username, Stephen Walsh /quest01, also this my old name, Stephen Walsh /proposition, both map over to my new Quest account, prod /swalch, and so on for all the users I might encounter in my notes application. Now, next week, when we show you the migration console, I'll show you some tools for helping you generate this big XML file much more easily, so you don't have to do it all manually. But people often would write scripts to kind of crawl their domino directory and dump out an XML file like this. It's not too hard to do. We also have group mappings the same way. The groups, this group in Notes is mapping to this group in my Active Directory. So if I didn't want to use an XML file, I do have other options. I could say, let's use a domino directory lookup. And so we'll do the lookup in domino directory. And we'll say, given a notes name, it's going to look up that notes name in the people view in the directory, and we're going to try to pull back the employee number, and that will work if employee number is a good login for SharePoint. In the SharePoint people picker, if you can put in your employee number and resolve to a username, then this is perfectly good. If not, you might have to pick some other field that's going to work. So people have custom fields in their notes directories. Anything that'll work as a login in SharePoint, employee number, email address, go ahead and pull that out as your mapping system. You can do the same thing in Active Directory. You can do a lookup, you can put in a query here. I don't know how to do Active Directory queries myself, but you can put in a query here that will look up in your Active Directory environment or any other LDAP server, and given the notes name, it will pull back. In this case, we'll pull down the distinguished name from the person record in Active Directory, and that will be what we use to log in to SharePoint for that user. So I'm going to put this back to my text file lookup, and then you'll see we can separately control user mapping versus group mapping. In this case, I'm doing them both from that same file, but you can do that. And then for the link tracking, you have to configure where your link tracking database exists if you want to use a link tracking system. So this link tracking database is typically called Quest Link Tracking. This was created when you first installed the tool. The tool should have offered you, do you want to create a link tracking database now? And if you did, this would just be configured for you. But you have different ways of connecting to the link tracking database. So while we're sitting here in options, I wanted to take a minute and show you the SharePoint options. So we have a concept of multiple environments, SharePoint environments, and then you can see here that I'm connecting to my default environment using classic mode authentication. These other three environments are using Office 365 authentication, and then if I wanted to, I could change this to say use the import service or other types of connections. So this is, by default, you will connect to everything using classic mode authentication, so you should be able to just start adding sites and migrating. But if you want to start using the import service, you'd come here to configure, to switch your connection type. And then we also have some options depending on what type of application, do you want to enable the link tracking service and so on. Okay, so we'll cover more about the setting up of connections when we talk about the import service on week number 4. Was there a question right now? Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah, so the question is about where you should migrate, where you should put your link tracking database. And you're asking the exact right questions. You know, you want to put this database so you can connect to it from wherever you need it. So if your team has, you know, a bunch of people all doing migrations, they all want to be able to connect to the same link tracking database. So, you know, some people would put this link tracking database on the same SQL Server instance that SharePoint is using. And then if you're talking about migrating to a staging environment and then later moving the content to production, you really want to make sure that if you want to have that full dynamic link tracking behavior, you want to make sure that all of these environments can connect to the database. Now, if your production environment can't connect to the database, which is certainly the case with Office 365 and it's the case with many lockdown environments, that's okay because we have that light version of our redirector page. It doesn't actually connect to the database, but it gives users a nice message, and you know, so they'll see a nice friendly message that says, you know, it'll offer them to link to the Notes version if they want to, or just wait until someone comes along and finalizes that sets of documents. Okay. So let's continue on with our slides now. Okay, so now we want to talk more about doing some custom application content. And so this time we're going to have to define our own source data definition, and we're going to have to define how we want to query data from that Notes application, and I'll also try to show you some of the data transformation options that we have. And the target side, we're going to design our own target data definition that defines how we want to write data out to SharePoint. And this will include the ability to kind of provision a whole new custom list using all the custom fields that we found in Notes. And so there's a lot of, between these two, you have a lot of options and a lot of power. And I'm going to try to capture a good number of those today. Some of those things we're going to be saving for the advanced migration section on week 3. So along the way, we're going to show you some of the other things you can do with your data mappings, and I pretty much already covered all the link handling and security options, so we won't need to say any more about that. So on the query side, when we're querying the data out of the Notes database, our source data definition allows you to select which records you want to migrate, you know, because you don't necessarily want to migrate every record in the database in one migration job. And then it allows you to define what columns you're going to be pulling out of each record. And this could include simple things like items that are in the documents, or it could include very complex things like formulas or items from the parent document and all sorts of things. And like I said, formulas can be used to transform data. Another important part of designing your query is thinking about your data types. You know, Notes is not, like I said, a relational database, so we don't have any guarantee of consistent data types between the different Notes documents. So our tool kind of allows you to impose some order on that chaos, and you can design a query where you're guaranteed a nice, consistent set of data coming into SharePoint. And we have some special constructs for rich text and images and attachments. So on the SharePoint side, that target data definition is going to define the schema of how we want to write data out to SharePoint. And so you'll define, you know, the various kinds of columns you want to write out to SharePoint, including the simple date, text, number columns, things like that. The rich text columns and URL columns, these might have doc links in them, and so we'll talk about how you deal with the doc links. User columns have usernames in them, and so anything you migrate to a user column, you know, so if you think of a task list, who is this task assigned to? That would be a user column. And so we need to migrate the Notes names over to AD names in order to populate the user columns. And then we can also now, with our latest version, support calculated columns. And then for keyword type of thing, keyword fields that you had in Notes, you might be using choice fields or lookup fields or managed metadata columns in SharePoint. And then a note on managed metadata columns, this is the only one on this list that we can't provision for you automatically. So for managed metadata, you actually have to do a manual step where you go into the SharePoint user interface and you manually configure, your manage metadata column, and then we can migrate it to it just fine. We can migrate lots of content to manage metadata. We'll be talking about that in a couple weeks. So when you're defining all this schema, you really have two paths that you might go down. You could either say, I want to take the notes schema that I had and basically generate a new schema. So I'm really copying over the schema I had in notes over to the SharePoint schema. Or you can go the other way. You can design a new list template in SharePoint. So you might put your developers on this to design a great new list template, and then you load that schema into our tool. And so then you can map one to the other. And by the way, like I mentioned, we can provision new lists using these custom templates over and over again. So you might load the schema for one custom template, and then we'll go provision that over and over again for multiple lists for you. Now for week 3, we'll also be talking about using content types, but I'm going to save that for now. But just for now, know that in addition to provisioning list schema, we can also provision content types, which allow you to do multiple types of documents all in one list. Okay, and then on the mapping, there's some issues that come up, and I won't be spending a lot of time on this, but you can map any field to anything in your source data definition to anything in the target data definition, as long as the data types match up correctly. And we have a lot of options that can influence how the data gets written. So I'll just show you this. And also there's some special considerations for mapping multivalued items. So notes databases tend to have a lot of multivalued items. You have multivalued text fields and multivalued number fields. So these are basically arrays that are stored in the notes document, an array of dates, an array of numbers. And that gets to be a problem when you migrate to SharePoint, because SharePoint supports multiple values for choice fields, manage metadata fields, lookup fields, and user fields, but not for the other fields. So if it's a text field or a number field, you can't make that multivalued in SharePoint. And so our tool kind of gives you two choices for how to deal with that. One is you could merge that into a single value. So here's an example of writing some formulas. I won't go into this now, but here's some notes formulas that will kind of convert a multi-valued item into a single valued item, either with a comma delimiter or a new line delimiter. And so that's one choice that people have. They'll take a multi-valued text item and they'll just put it into a multi-lined text field in SharePoint and using new line separators. Another new choice is to normalize the data. So you could take, let's say you had an array of text items that were comments. You could normalize that out into a separate list where it's a one-to-many relationship. You have one header document with multiple related documents. And so this will be something that we have in version 6.1 as well. You can actually do this today. It's just a little harder to do it. You have to run multiple migration jobs, one for the header document and one for the list items. It's possible to do it today, but it's kind of a pain. So it'll be a lot better with 6.1. So we'll be talking about that in a couple weeks as well. So let's switch over now to our demos. Okay, and now I want to switch gears and pick a custom application. So let me close down these document library ones, and let's show you a custom application that we have. So I purposely picked one that wasn't too complicated. This is a custom application we got from one of our customers, and so if I open one of these documents, you can see it's really not too fancy. It's got a few extra fields. There's a title field, and this the document type is documentation in this case. You've got a keyword field here that picks. I forget what they call this. I think this is the document type, and this is the category, and so on. So just a little bit of extra things here. This is a field where you can paste your icons and images. And then we've got this little document history and so on. So I'm going to try to migrate this now. So pretend I've never seen this application before. I'm just going to go try to design a migration job for it. So I'm going to go into our tool and say new migration job. No, I don't want to save the last one. And so again, the first thing I do is I select it. I select the database. And then notice that this time I did not get that pop-up that said, hey, do you want to load a default data definition? Because this is a custom application. We don't have any default data definitions. So now instead of loading a predefined data definition, I need to create one from scratch. So I can create one, and the first thing is to select the right records. So I can select records based on the view. I might say I want records in the all documents view or any other view, and a notes view might filter the documents. If you have a view that only shows a subset of your data, you're going to be selecting those records for migration. I can also select records based on the form, and this is a new feature in version 6.1. So I could select a record, all the records that were designed with this Doco form notes. And so basically this is kind of a new UI for doing this, and it's a nice convenience. Just so you know, in the current version of the tool that's shipping, you can do the same thing by just doing a formula that says form equals quote and then whatever that was. Oops. So this would be an equivalent way to select documents by form. It's just a little more user-friendly here. And there's other advantages here to doing it this way, which I'll show you in a second. So if I go to my Data Fields tab, I can add columns for reading the data out of notes one at a time. I could add a column and say it's of type item, and the name is XYZ, and so on. Instead of doing that, I'm going to use this little picker here. I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to instead say select items and columns. And so this is showing me the data in the notes database that I might want to select. So if I'm migrating by form, I could look at all the fields on that form, and let's just say I want to migrate all those. Or I could look at the sampled items, and so based on that record selection, we sample the first 20 items here, and we look at all the fields that are found actually on those data documents. So you can see there's more on the data documents than there were on the form. And a lot of those extra things are going to be internal things like these $ fields. Some of them may be important though. Sometimes you'll have, like, it looks like this chapter ID that was generated by some code. It wasn't on the form design, but it was written out by code. So you'll develop your own style for the application, but typically you might just start by grabbing all the sampled items and removing the ones you don't really want. Or you might start with the form and then adding those extra ones you want, like chapter ID and so on. So either way you get to the same place. I'm actually going to deselect a couple of these too, because there's a last updated field and a last updated by field, and this icon field and the attached field. I just know that I'm not going to need those, because we've already shown you how this data, this last by and updated by, even though they're storing this as a field in notes, I'm going to just choose as the migration person that I'm going to just use the out-of-band metadata that's in the document library. So I already showed you how we preserve those. And the same with security. This readers field, which is a list of readers for the document, I don't want to explicitly migrate that one because because I'm going to migrate the security, again, using that out-of-band security migration that I've already showed you. So let's just stick with these columns here, and then you can see that we've generated columns now. Like this type field is an item, and the title field is an item, and the roles type is an item. These are all items out of the document. For this rich text field, the details field is a rich text field. Notice we give you a few different columns here. We give you automatically a details HTML, which is really a column of type rich text instead of item. reading out of the details field, and we just give it an alias details HTML. And so we're going to be extracting the HTML out of that rich text field, so that's something I could map over to a field in SharePoint. Similarly, we define an attachments column to get all the attachments out of that details field, and same with objects and same with embedded images. So we have these different types, image, and so if you want to, in some cases you could manually create these, but usually our picker does the right thing for these rich text fields. Now I do want to show you adding a couple other fields manually. So I'm going to add one field here, and I'm going to, instead of a type of item, I'm going to make this type formula. So what I want to do here is I want to do a notes formula at uppercase. What should I do? I'll do type. And I'm going to just call this upper type. And I'm going to say, if I thought it was going to be multi-valued, I could set it to be multi-valued, but I won't in this case. And I want to say the return type I always want to be a string. And so this is where we're adding that, consistency of data types, because in general, in Notes application, the type field might be missing. It even is possible that the type field is a numeric value in some, or a date field. As far as we know, it could be anything in one of the data documents. So here I'm saying I want to extract this data, and I want to whatever it turns out to be in the database, or whatever this formula yields, I'm going to always cast it to a string in our data query, so we're going to get a nice consistent data set going into SharePoint. So let's preview this now. So you can see, again, I have all this metadata that I'm pulling out of Notes. And you can see this type field is things like help, deliverables matrix, and here's computed field, upper type, is the uppercase version of that. So you can see I've kind of transformed the data as I'm querying it out of the Notes database. And by the way, you can do all sorts of things with formulas. You can do DB lookups to pull data out of another view or even another Notes database. So that's sort of like doing a join in relational terms. You can do things to resolve keyword fields. You'll find a lot of cases where Notes was storing the internal value, 1, 2, 3, 4, or A, B, C, D, and that should translate over to a friendly name like north, east, south, and west, or something like that. So you can resolve those keyword fields into a more friendly version for putting into SharePoint using formulas. Okay, so that's our source data definition, and by the way, I could save this as a reusable data definition, so every time I found another database of this type with this template, it would reuse that data definition. A nice convenience here. I won't do that now. And for the SharePoint side, I want to define how I'm going to write this data out into SharePoint. So I'm going to select a site. So I'll select that same site, and I'll create a new list. I'll call this test list 2. And again, I want to give the tool permission to create this list in SharePoint and add it to the quick launch area. And again, because this is a new list from scratch, I didn't get that pop-up, do I want to load a default target data definition? So instead I'm going to create one from scratch. And then this target data definition editor, by the way, is one of the places where we've done a bit of UI work. So you might recognize this is a little different than the shipping product. And in particular, this section about content types, that's new in 6.1. We'll be talking about that in a couple weeks. But most of this stuff is the same. It's just rearranged a little differently. So I could say that the list type that I want to migrate to could be a document library, could be discussion, or other list, and I could even specify a specific template here. If I've designed some custom template I want to use, I could pick it here. I'm just going to leave that blank because I just want to do a new custom list from scratch. In the Data Fields tab, I can define the data fields that I want to write out from SharePoint. And a really nice, convenient button is this one right here, where I'm going to load this schema for SharePoint I'm going to generate this from the notes schema. So basically we've now defined some SharePoint fields, such as category is going to be a text field, details is going to be a note field, that's a SharePoint internal term for rich text field, enhanced HTML field in SharePoint. Internally they call that a note field. And I want to actually rearrange things a little bit, because the order we have here is the order these fields are going to be provisioned in SharePoint. So I'm going to move the title up to the top, and I'm actually going to rename this. The title field, let's call this My Title. Now, as you probably know, custom lists in SharePoint always have a title field, and that's the thing that you could click on. You can have a title field in your view, and you click on that to open the document. We actually have a feature here that allows you to take the existing title field and rename it to whatever you want. So if I just say is title field equals true, we could call this anything. This could be last name or customer name or whatever, but that will rename the title field to be customer name, and that will be the thing you click on in your views. So I'm going to also take the category field, and I'm going to change the type in SharePoint to be a choice field. And with my choice fields, I have options similar to the fields that I have if you were migrating in SharePoint. Do I want to use radio buttons? Do I want to allow multiple values? And actually I will say multiple values in this case. And I also want to set this flag, add missing choices. And what that means is that as I'm migrating content to this choice field, I'm going to use the values that I find and make them all legal choices for the choice field. So I'm actually going to upgrade the schema of the choice field with all the values that we find in notes. Now, some of these properties here are new in 6.1, such as setting this to be a required field, setting the default value. So these are the same things you could have done if you went into SharePoint UI and designed this column automatically. We just kind of completed this list in 6.1 of all the properties that you might want to specify. Do I want to add this to all the views? I'll say yes, add to all views. And even a few things that are hard to do in the SharePoint UI, like make it a read-only field, and your data validation. You put a data validation formula in here. I can show off briefly our new cool formula editor. But I won't get into this now, because this is more about the design migration. So I'll just show you that we have a formula editor now, and so on. So just to quickly complete this, notes type I also want to move up to the top, and I'll make that, roles type, I'm going to make that a choice field as well. And I'm going to add all the missing values to the choice field. Only this one, let's use radio buttons. And the chapter ID, I'll just move up to the top, but I'll leave it to be a text field. And the notes type, same thing. And the upper type. So remember, the upper type is the uppercase version, and notice that by default the type field got renamed to notes type, and the reason is type is a reserved word, so our tool automatically, when we're generating the schema, kind of watch out for reserved words and things like that. So if you see notes prefixed, that's what happened, is type was a reserved word in SharePoint. But I can call it anything I want. I can call it, my type. And chapter ID, I want to call it chapter space ID. You couldn't use spaces in notes, but you can in SharePoint, so I'm going to just make this a little prettier. Roles type. Roles type, I'll put a space in that one as well. So yeah, I'm just kind of prettying up my list here. And then my publish status will move up here as well. And so at the bottom we'll have our big rich text field, the details, and then the attachments are things we can map to. So on the Advanced tab, we have our checkbox, migrate attachments as image, migrate the attachment icons as images. So instead of a little text link, you'll get an icon link in your list. And then this part here is also new, and we'll be talking about that in a couple weeks. And this is where we can migrate the views from Notes over to SharePoint. So this is a beta 6.1 feature that we'll save for later. Okay, so that's my target data definition. And on my mapping tab, I can press Auto Map, and we're going to automatically map all these pieces. So as we made these changes, we remembered where it came from. So the title field maps to this My Title. Remember, I renamed that. Roles type maps to roles type with a space, and so on. Now, if I want to go back and edit these, I can say edit the source, and I can look at how title field is defined in my source data definition. Or I can say edit the target and look at how my title is defined in the target. It's just a convenience to reopen the source and target data definitions. And you can add other mappings here, like I already showed you, mapping something to the folder field. I'll show you we can define a new field on the fly. So let's take the category field and map it to a new column called category 2. So we're just kind of adding a new field on the fly here. It's the same thing as if we had went into the SharePoint tab, added the field, and then did the mapping. Okay, so let's just run this migration job now. So we're going to provision this new list in SharePoint. And if all went well, we're going to be migrating lots of data. So there's about 95 records here. I'm just going to go to the list immediately. I won't wait for all of them. And so here we've got the first dozen or so records. Let's open one of these. And so you can see we have a nice looking document here. So we've got our images in place. Remember, I checked that box that says I want my image icons. So we got that, even though it made the file a little bigger. If I go into edit mode, I can see that, didn't wait long enough. I can see that the category field was made into a choice field with checkboxes. Also, the roles type was made into a choice field with radio buttons. And these others, like the chapter ID field, the help field, we just left those as simple text fields for now. But notice that the list of all the legal choices came from the notes data itself. And as we continue to migrate these things, I bet if I refresh this, we might see additional things pop up because we're still migrating some records. And then we have our big rich text field. Notice that the upper type was the computed version, the uppercase help, and so on. And then all the images and attachments went down here. One thing I should point out here is that as we did this migration, we're showing the images and attachments in place inside the rich text, which is the way it was in Notes. So it's important to preserve the location of that, but really the images and attachments are just normal list item images and attachments, and they show in the attachments area, but we display links to them in the HTML. So in the HTML, the user can just click on this and open the PDF document or whatever it is. Okay, so that is, I'll just cancel that. I'll open another one of these here. That is the basics of custom application migration from a content perspective. So getting all the content over. So that's different than migrating the design. So, depending on the application, what we did might be good enough. So for a lot of applications, you're going to find that the user is going to be perfectly happy just with this new SharePoint look of this big single column with all the fields with the right types. So, we're hoping that that's going to be good enough for most applications. For some other applications, we need to preserve the look and feel of this form, because remember, this notes form had a completely different layout here. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to show you how we can migrate the form design to go with that list, and that'll be in the design migration section. But right now, for the content migration, we're just getting the data over. We didn't lose any business data. We got perfect fidelity in our rich text, and our doc links work, and our security works, and everything. So that's all part of the content migration story. So let's return to the list. I know we're starting to run over a little bit, so if people have to drop off, we're just right at the 90-minute mark right now. I understand, and we will have a recording of this session available shortly if you want to catch the tail end of this. But we'll keep going, and I'm happy to run over, and we'll have time for questions and answers at the end. So let's return to our slides. Okay, so other aspects of migrating content that we're going to cover later. I showed you generating folders based on some piece of notes data. I could have also controlled file names. So if you have embedded images or objects, those don't necessarily have a file name, but you could take some piece of notes data and map it to the file name for these attachments. We can also, if we're doing incremental migrations, we can control the duplicate document handling. And I forgot to show you that, but I'll do that next time we get into the demos. But for incremental migrations, it's nice to be able to say, if we're remigrating the same database on a nightly basis, for example, what do you want to do when a user edits a notes document? We can decide we want to migrate that as an additional document, or just blow away the old one, or use SharePoint versioning. You can say if a notes document was edited since the last time you migrated it, we want to create a new version in SharePoint. And then coming in session 3, we're going to talk about more content migration things, including working with SharePoint document sets, manage metadata, putting images and attachments in alternate libraries, and then generating documents, like I mentioned, generating Word documents or PDF documents or even InfoPath documents. So we'll have a lot to talk about in this session, including generation of pages, web part pages, publishing pages, and so on. So just to kind of recap, we do have a list of, I want to remind you that we have a choice of targets. All the demos I showed were migrating to a list. You can also migrate to other SharePoint templates like discussion lists and calendar lists. You can migrate to document libraries. You can migrate to these different page types like wiki pages, basic pages, and so on. And you can migrate to generated documents. And so we'll be covering all this in the future. And here's a screenshot of migrating to wiki pages, or in this screenshot, but you can also migrate to basic pages, web part pages, and publishing pages. Now the last feature I want to talk about today is this render feature. And so this is, like I said, is one of my favorite features of the product, because it helps you cut the cost of your migration projects. So if you've got 1,000 databases to migrate, you might not want to migrate the design of all those databases. You might not want to go through what I just went through to figure out how to map every field. You just want to get the content over in some quick and easy way that looks good and is searchable and so on in SharePoint. So I'm going to just switch back into my demos for a minute. So I'm going to go back over to I'm going to do a new migration job. No, I don't want to say that. Let's select, I'm going to go back to that first QDemo document library again. And I'm going to say, yes, I want the standard data definition. Oh, actually, no, I'm going to say, no, I don't want the standard data definition. The reason is I want to load a special data definition that comes with our tool called render. So the rendering data definition is basically sort of you can think of it as sort of a universal translator for notes applications. Because we can take any notes document you have and render it with its default form. So if I briefly look at this data definition, I'll show you how that works. In our data fields, instead of body, HTML, and so on, we have render HTML. So that's using our column type render, and we're saying we want to render with the default form, and every document we're going to just generate one big HTML data stream that we can migrate to SharePoint. And because I left the form name blank, we're going to just use the default form for every document. Every document has a default form in it with it in Notes, and so if you wanted to, you could specify a form here that you're using for purposes of migrating things, of laying out things for migrating. But we're basically going to render every document with its form, and we're also going to pull out the attachments that will show in the rendered document and the images and the objects and so on. So you don't even really need to understand all that. You just load in their rendered document template, and then in the SharePoint side, we'll just select again a list. We'll just call this test list 3, and then we're going to load a data definition for a custom list again. I'm just taking a shortcut here instead of laying it out from scratch. And I'm going to create this list on SharePoint. And then I'm going to take all the default mappings. Only this time we're mapping render HTML to the body field and attachments, images, and so on. So let's run this job real quick. And so I'm going to just jump over to that list while it's migrating. And let's open one of these documents. So you see what happened here. We took the document and we laid it out the way it looked in its notes form. So we go back to notes and look at that document library. You can see the form is laid out with this little icon back here and this brown table with all these fields on it. So in SharePoint, we just generated one big rich text area with that exact same look and feel. So this is all just now text in a table. So you can full text search on all this text. But the point is that this was really quick and easy. We did not have to think about migrating this field and this field and this field. We didn't have to think about redesigning a form. It's just all one nice looking rich text document. So you get all the features, and you can pick as many fields as you want. You can add metadata that you want to explicitly migrate, like the category field and the title field, but you don't have to, and that's the point, that you can just do the ones you care about. And everything else still looks the way it looked in notes. Your users will be comfortable with it, and you didn't have to spend a long time. So obviously the functionality of this application doesn't work anymore, so this is just good for those applications where you just want to keep the content. You don't want to worry about the functionality. So I promised you I'd show you one wiki page example. So let me just go over to the SharePoint list, and let's just call this test wiki 1, and I'm going to load a target data definition of type wiki page. So we have a wiki target data definition pre-built for you, and then if I just press my auto map, we're going to automatically map. You know, our data definitions know about each other, so we know automatically how to map to these different things in, you know, the subject is going to become the page name for this wiki page, and we're going to render, you know, the HTML migrates to something called the wiki field, which is where all the rich text is in a wiki page, and so on. So if you wanted to, you could get fancy and customize this. Wiki pages are fairly simple constructs, so you can pretty much use our data definitions out of the box. So let me quickly run that. So here we've generated a wiki library where we have a bunch of wiki pages. So if I open this white oak, you can see in this case we've done the render version. I could have just put the body field in the wiki page, but instead I rendered the whole thing. So now we have a really nice UI. Users can come along and just see the whole page the way it looked like in Notes. And if a user wants to edit this, you know, wiki fields are really nice now in SharePoint 2010. We have a great rich text editor, a little better than the list item editor in my opinion, and so on. So just want to close with that solution for rendering things. And so like I said, with a large migration project, you might find 10–20% of the applications you can get away with just rendering them so they look good, and you don't have to rebuild things. So you can save yourself some money that way. Okay, back to the slides now for the last time. And the only other thing I want to cover is how you guys can get into our beta program. And so, like I said, this beta program launched last week, and so you can all join our beta program. So beta program is on the SharePoint for All website, which is one of our Quest communities. And so if you go to this URL, you can either sign into this community using your Quest community ID. And if you don't have one, it's really easy to just create a new one. You put in your name and email address. And so once you've done this, you have to ask to join this group. So there's a button that says, I want to join this beta group. You'll be a member of the community, but you ask to join the group. And our only request is that you don't use Gmail or other email addresses that we can't verify. Just use your corporate email, either your customer email if you're embedded at a customer, or your consultant, account email, just so we can quickly verify that you are who you say you are and all that. And then we'll let you into our beta program. And once you're in there, you can download an extensive reviewer's guide that talks about all the new features, such as migrating views and migrating content types and things like that. And then, of course, the installer for the full product, which you can install. So we definitely encourage people there. So I see there's some questions and answers lit up here. So let me just take a quick look at the Q&A area. So there's a question about metadata mapping, metadata remapping. So the general solution that would be to use a formula. You can write a formula that says, if the value is this, you want to convert it to this. And that's just a simple if statement in a notes formula. So that's one way you can do it. Managed metadata fields in particular offer you one other choice, and we'll be talking more about managed metadata in session 3, but managed metadata fields allow you to use aliases, and so you can set up all the old terms as aliases, and then you migrate, and then all your documents are written with the right term GUIDs, and then you can remove the aliases after you migrate, and so they'll just display with the new values instead of the old values. So that's another option for metadata mapping. Yep. Another question, can we map or migrate or concatenate more than one notes column to one SharePoint column? That's an excellent question, and to answer that I'm going to go back to my demo here real quick. So if I were to look at my target data definition here and look at all the columns I have defined, remember this in this case this was columns for a wiki page because that's the last demo I ran. All right, I just add a new column, and most of the column types have the capability to concatenate data, and so the way that's expressed is like let's say I was migrating to a rich text field. That's expressed by allow multiple sources. So if I say allow multiple sources equals true, then in my mapping tab I can just add one thing. Let's see, I can map the subject field to field 6, and then I can add category field to field 6, and so on, and all these will get concatenated into one big field 6. So the trick is, again, you have to say allow multiple sources equals true. So you can do this with attachment fields, with note fields, and a few other fields. If it's something simple like a rich text, like a plain text field, then you'd have to use a formula to do the concatenation. You can use a formula to concatenate one value with another value. And one other thing that's worth mentioning here, I forgot to tell you that you can also map constant values. So let me add another mapping to field 6, only I'm going to say I don't want to map from a source field. Source field equals none, and so that means the field mapping is of type constant. And then you can just put in, and also I can even put a new line here. So I can map a constant field to field 6. So if I just order that properly, what's going to happen here is it's going to map the subject and then the string and also. Oh, actually I shouldn't have put the quotes here. That's an extra quote. And then the categories. So we kind of concatenate these three parts, a value, a constant, a value, into one big rich text field. So that's commonly done here. Okay, so let's see, let me get back to my slides so I can see the other questions. Okay. Okay, it looks like Rogers had a question. He raised his hand at one point. Well, I couldn't see that as I was doing the demos. Did you have a question, Roger? Are you still on? Okay. Okay. Well, fair enough. If anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question now, or we can close it out. All right. Well, thank you all for joining. We're happy to have you, and like I said, these recordings will be available. We're going to send out an email with the location to everyone who's registered for this event, even if you didn't attend today, with the location of the recording, because we know a lot of people want to get to all the sessions, but they have busy working lives and they can't always get to everything. So we'll send out an email to all of you with this location. Meanwhile, a good resource is my blog site, where you can find instructions for the beta program for one thing, also a lot of tech notes about doing different things with the product. And you can download the product itself here. If you don't want to use the beta version, you can always just download a trial version at the product URL on the Quest website. So thank you very much, and we'll resume next week.